All right, well, it is straight up 12 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started as we have a few more people logging on. But uh, thank you, everyone, for joining us here this afternoon, and thank you to Senator Mathis, Representative Donahue. Unfortunately, Representative Hinson is not able to be with us today. Um, and then we also have Superintendent Janelle Brower with the Marion Independent School District, Superintendent Shannon Bisgard with the Linn-Mar Independent or the Linn-Mar Community School District. And I believe City Manager Lon Pluckon will join us here at some point this hour as well. So one of the reasons timing-wise that we wanted to have this just informal dialogue report back per se is I think we all know that the legislature reconvened about a week and a half ago for an abbreviated session to really pick up and attempt to finish some of the work of the legislative session that had been placed on hold because of the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. This morning, the Marion Economic Development Board of Directors met, and we were providing just a very brief legislative update. And Senator Mathis, you would perhaps recall that, and Representative Donahue, I think you were there as well. There was a group from our community down at the State House on, I think, the last day that the legislature was in session. And that seems like in some ways years and years ago, but in some ways just yesterday. Boy, a lot has happened in that short amount of time. So we're going to kind of have this be more of a informal Q&A type of session. I've got some questions on some topics that we have looked through and thought through, but we also want you as participants to feel free to ask some questions as well. So hopefully at this point you're all familiar with using the chat feature here in the wonderful world of Zoom. Feel free to submit any questions that you might have through that chat feature, and we'll watch for some of those questions to come in. So again, some long days last week for the legislature. Some of you that were on about 5 or 7 minutes ago, I asked Senator Mathis and Representative Donahue if their head was out of the fog yet, because they definitely pulled an all-nighter Saturday into Sunday and then some long days prior to that. Our organization has a lobbyist that we work with on behalf of Professional Developers of Iowa. He indicated he was in the Capitol for 22 hours straight. So lots and lots of things happened over the weekend. I thought I'd just start out by hearing from each Senator Mathis and then Representative Donahue on the House side. Take us back over these last few days. If you could summarize some of the big things that happened. I think obviously our group is most interested from a business perspective, but just reflect back per se on the last few days. And I think in some ways we're all still digesting a little bit of what happened over the weekend. So Senator Mathis, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Nick. It was an understatement to say it was a very strange session. So as Nick said, about March 16th, 17th, we were recessed, and the legislative session was suspended. And so we went back on June 3rd. And so we went from really doing a lot of work with our constituents at home in regard to the small business loan program and PPP and unemployment claims, to then thrust into this other world of trying to finish up policy that we've been talking about in January, February, and early March. So that was kind of a turnaround, because a lot of us wanted to keep talking about, well, what are we going to do with our unemployment claims? What are we going to do, about the emergency funds? And we did get into those conversations, but I wish they would have been more robust. But needless to say, we came away, from my perspective, really not enough help for the hospitals, and really, kind of more of a blueprint for how do we get things flowing again? What's the transition into what this new normal is going to look like? We didn't converse about a lot of that, but I talked to Logan Shine, the governor's aide, and they are working on a blueprint for that. They're trying to figure out what this fall looks like in regard to education and all of that. So we did do some historic legislation in regard to justice reform, which I'll let Molly talk about that a little bit. We did fund education, at the GOP increase of 2 point plus so nothing was clawed back or nothing was redone. I was a little disconcerted about there was an elections bill that I think will affect all of us in regard to absentee balloting and our county auditors and our state Secretary of State. The telehealth was a #1 ask by hospitals and healthcare providers. And we did get an agreement by Wellmark that we hope other commercial insurers will follow, that telehealth will be at parity until February 1st. I thought that was a good thing because it's such a broad spectrum. It affects business, people who are going back to work and may have some mental health issues or may have some medical issues, and they can use telehealth and still, the doctors, nurses, healthcare providers will be reimbursed at full reimbursement rate. And then I was a little disappointed that children's mental health funding was not addressed. There was just so much going on, and it kind of got pushed by the wayside. So we talked about that on the floor. We talked about a lot of different healthcare issues in regard to how hospitals are bleeding right now, and especially rural hospitals. We talked about the possibility of some of the rural hospitals closing and how that would affect business. How would that affect communities when they no longer have a hospital there? So that's kind of my overview from the Senate side.
Sure. Representative Donahue, how about your perspective on the House side?
Well, let's just start with the historic agreement first, because, that was the best thing that actually happened, I think, in this last 2 weeks. And that really comes down to we have 5 members of our Black Caucus. Really, in particular, KO, Representative Abdul Samad, and Representative Ross Smith. We're working very closely with the governor in making sure that we could come up with a plan and some kind of a process that would help our African American communities and keep them protected. We came up with a great plan. It was bipartisan vote all across the board for both the House and in the Senate. And it's a great start, but that's exactly what it is. It's just a foundation. It's just a start. There's a lot of other things that we need to do in our justice areas as well, so we can get some reform there to also make sure that our policies are not affecting our Black and brown community members more adversely than anyone else, which is what's happening right now. So that was great. We got that done, and it was probably the best day of the 2 weeks. I really spent most of my time there we needed to do the budgets. Those had to be done. But some of the other stuff that happened really didn't make a lot of sense in the times that we're in today with COVID. We really were trying to work on what we needed to do for our schools to make sure that we can have a safe opening in the fall, or what are we going to do in the fall, the plan that we are going to have. We really needed to be working on making sure we protect our workers, the ones that kept our state afloat through this entire time period. And instead we took basically their rights away because they no longer have the ability to stand up for themselves if something happens to them because of COVID. We had some great successes, bipartisan successes throughout the whole session, and I could go through the whole list that I have right here. And we had some that unfortunately didn't make it that were bipartisan, but didn't make it to the governor, or the governor didn't choose to sign. I mean, there's lots of things that we could have done, but we spent far too much time on some things that were unnecessary at the end.
From a business perspective, one of the big wins, especially from some of our partners with organizations like ABI, talked about the liability protections, some of that legislation that was passed for employers that are, we're trying to create environments that employers can be comfortable and confident, bringing people back to work, provide perspective perhaps from each chamber on how that piece of legislation came together.
Well, in the Senate, we looked at a bill. This was the bill that came from the Senate and then went over to the House. Basically, it would guard business and healthcare providers from coronavirus-related lawsuits, and then it limits who can file, and it raises the bar for what they can file for. And there were many, many businesses that really did all that they could, really good businesses, to spread the virus, but and I agree with healthcare professionals that they may have done all that they could for someone, but I don't believe the meatpacking plants did enough. And there were several businesses that didn't do enough because basically we heard from our constituents and from employees that were scared to death that they felt they were being forced to go back to work. So there's a split there. A person can still sue, but they have to prove that the business owner intended to make people sick. So that's the provision in the bill. And that's going to be very hard for, I think, people who may have been wrong to do. AARP was very much against this because, of course, there are a lot of elderly, passed away in nursing homes, healthcare facilities, hospitals, and they felt that they should have an avenue where they could be compensated for something that went wrong. But there is a provision if they can prove that there were issues around it. But it doesn't block workers from filing unemployment compensation claims. So right now there's a family of a deceased meatpacking worker in Storm Lake that has filed already. So although we did give immunity, and I'm hoping that that immunity is used when everyone did everything that they could possibly do and did it right. However, there's still some, for me anyway, there's still some, I have some discomfort with some of the provisions in the bill that just say immunity is granted and you have to really prove if somebody intended to do you wrong.
So go ahead, Molly, sorry.
I was going to say, I would agree with Senator Mathis. There were most of the businesses were doing what they needed to do to protect their people. And I understand them needing that security. However, there are bad actors out there, and we all know there are in every single field. And those bad actors are going to use this, and it's unfortunate because we do have so many people who have been so sick from this, and it does happen to be in most of those environments like the meatpacking plants or in those tight quarters where they're working on the assembly lines. And those people, it's almost impossible to keep them safe when they're shoulder to shoulder working like that. And they no longer have any recourse. So that's what's the unfortunate part of that immunity.
Nick, I want to bring up, Medco did a great job, and Economic Development over in Cedar Rapids did too, about putting out, safeguards for businesses, saying this is what you need to do. These are the things you need to look at in terms of who your employees are and where they are, what they do, and then your transition back. So that was a really good blueprint, I think, for businesses that were very concerned about their employee safety. My husband and I own a business, as all of you know. We employ 50 people, and all of them are still working from home. They really haven't gone back into the office yet, but they actually brought up the Medco, a list of things that were good for transition, and they're actually working with that and working off of that. So there are a great many businesses that are doing the right thing, but for those that aren't, I agree with Molly, this may give them an out.
Yeah.
So.
And by the way, the schools did a nice job during handing out lunches with the social distancing and all the gear too. I made my way around to many of them, and I actually worked at a lot of them in Cedar Rapids. So, everybody was trying to make sure everyone was safe.
So I'm going to come back to this state stuff, but you brought up meals, Molly. And so I want to throw a question out to Superintendent Brower and BizGuard. We have, people are wondering, we've transitioned now to summer and meal programs have changed, and probably the volumes and ways that school districts can provide meals has changed. Can each of you provide a quick perspective on what that has looked like? And do we feel like as a community that the gaps are being filled that need to be filled over the summer months? Janelle, I'll start with you.
Sure, thanks, Nick. One thing that I think has been, quite frankly, an advantage within the Marion community is that we have historically had a summer lunch program through the FLY program. And so we were able, both in Linn-Mar and within Marion ISD, to transition from our school lunch program to the FLY program, picked up the next day. So school stopped, I believe it was June 3rd. FLY program went into effect June 4th. They were able to coordinate with us in looking at what sites we were providing lunches and transition that, so that for families it was pretty seamless. We passed out flyers in the last few days just to notify families, and they were able then to make that leap right away. So we have many community volunteers and a great program there that's not new to our community. So I think that helps as well.
Yeah. Shannon, you guys leverage the Fly program as well. How's that transition been from your perspective?
Like Janelle said, the transition with Fly has been really seamless for us. And I can't say there have been a lot of seamless things that have happened in this whole COVID world. So it's nice to have that happen as efficiently as it did. And I do agree with Janelle that I think a lot of that's because Fly is so established here and it's been such a great program for so long that coordination between our nutrition service staff and the Fly coordinators really helped that process transition from our meal program right over to Fly. Like Janelle said, literally the very next day. And our numbers continued to go up all spring. And I think Fly they were aware of that. I think they were anticipating large numbers this summer as well. So I think that helped them to kind of increase their plans that they normally might see in the summertime.
Yeah, that's great. Let's come back to the state level here and talk about budget. Molly, you mentioned that obviously that was something big that at the end of the day is probably the thing that the legislature needed to hammer out during this abbreviated session. And, you know, we're continuing to get updates and debriefs and breakouts as far as what's in the appropriations bill and where did we really land on the budget. Some of the initial summaries that we've seen is in some ways, as far as the appropriations bill is concerned, it was a little bit of a status quo approach. There weren't necessarily any new initiatives that were able to be pursued or funded, but at the same time, perhaps there weren't any significant cuts to some of our workforce programs, things like Last Dollar scholarships, Future Ready Iowa, some of those things that I think have had strong bipartisan support over the last couple of years. So that's good, but people are wondering, gee, what kind of condition is the state in? And, from a reserve standpoint, from a ending general fund balance standpoint, perhaps we're not taking care of everything that we need to or could, but it seems to be, compared to a lot of states, that Iowa's in a pretty decent position just from call it a cash standpoint. There are some states that would perhaps love to have a little bit of the reserves that we have, all things considered. Is that a fair assessment as far as how this all played out?
Well, do you want Molly to go first, or what would you like, Nick?
Either way. Either way, you can thumb wrestle for it somehow later.
So here's what happened. We're required to balance the budget in the state of Iowa. You're right, Nick. There are some other states that would love to have, some of our fund balances. So we spent at 95.71%. And so we have now 348 million under the expenditure limitation. So that means we'll have that as pad going forward. Our FY21 budget with this bill standing unlimited appropriations, school aid and transportation equity is 7.77 billion, and the Senate target was 19 million lower than the House passed bill. But it's about 26 million increase over estimated net of FY20. So you're right, it's about status quo. We had some issues that we had to address in terms of if they were COVID related or not. So I'm going to briefly go down. We kept, our 2.3 increase, promise to K-12. We reduced the regions, however, by 8 million. That was a Republican initiative. I think Democrats pushed back pretty strongly on that, but in the end, it came to an 8 million reduction. And I just talked to a regent last night. They're really trying to figure out what's gonna happen. UNI will be, of course, on the short end of the stick there. So if you're a UNI alum, call them, see what you can do. We've reduced some other departments. So one that I was disappointed with was the judicial branch by 500,000, and they're short as it is. We reduced the Secretary of State by 250,000. I think that that's a little bit of a retaliation against the Secretary of State for sending absentees out, although no one will really say that. We decreased some money to Medicaid, but there will be some CARES Act money that's going to flow into Medicaid temporarily. I'm looking down my list. Rural psychiatry residencies were funded. There were no MCO, managed care organization increases. The property tax credits, so the taxpayer relief fund appropriations, the homestead property tax credit got 2.7, elderly and disabled tax credit 2.4, and these appropriations will fully fund credits. So at the end, you had another question for us, Nick, was the rainy day funds. So cash reserve is now at 587 million. Economic emergency fund is at 195.9 million. So combined, that's 783 million we have in between cash reserve and economic, and our taxpayer relief fund is at 105. So yes, I think other states are envious, but at the same time, we're thinking, hey, this is a time that you should spend on schools, you should spend on higher education, and why didn't we? I think that was a missed opportunity. We should have, I don't think we should have reduced the Regents institutions by 8 million. So.
Representative Donahue, perspective on the budget?
Honestly, I am not the best on the budget at this point. I'm still trying to dig into it all myself, but I will tell you that the education portion, as Liz just said, we dug pretty deep into those Regents, and there's no, we didn't have to. We could always do better for our education. Obviously, that's near and dear to my heart, as that is the one reason why I ran in the first place. Obviously, many other things are important as well, but I always want to see our schools getting what they need, and that is a problem here in this budget.
Is it true, however, that are we still projecting that we will have some kind of surplus or excess balance at the end of this current fiscal year? Is that true?
You're muted. Liz, you're muted.
Liz, you're muted.
Sorry. I'm going to come pretty close because we had to use some of that, of course, for Medicaid. Medicaid was higher. But I think that most of that money will be used. I don't think any of that will be carried over.
Okay. Let me turn and send a question to our city manager, Lon Pluckon, as we talk about budgets and impacts at different levels of government, and what amounts of federal dollars have the potential of flowing through state to local. Still lots of questions, I think. Lon, it's probably been 30 days since we've had one of these conversations. Over the past 30 days, has there been any additional clarity or expenses incurred that help you to better understand how a municipality such as Marion might be impacted through this pandemic?
Yeah, a couple of things have happened. We got our first quarterly payment for hotel motel tax since the pandemic started, and we expected it to see a pretty steep decline. So it was no surprise that it was down by about 60% from the prior quarter. The good news for us is that we were pretty conservative in how we budgeted for the increase this year with the new hotel going online. So even though it was low, I think it still put us at 108% of what we had budgeted for the current year. So we're in pretty decent shape on that. The bigger question is how long it'll take for that to really recover. You know, some of our bigger drivers like Prospect Meadows have gotten back in business, so we would expect in the next quarter we may see that to recover. The longer term ones are what's the impact going to be on road use tax, and what's the impact going to be on local option sales tax. Frankly, we've really struggled getting any clarity from the state on what they expected the impact of adding in online sales to the local option sales tax was going to be. And then with road use tax, it's just DOT always is slow on updating their model and getting information out. But for us, we could weather in the course of the next fiscal year probably a 25% reduction for maybe 3 calendar quarters in road use tax without it really starting to impact operations. If it extends beyond that, we're going to have to start looking at making some structural changes. Of all the areas that it hits our revenues, that's the only one that we really use for staff and operating support. It pays for the street crew and road patching and a lot of our small repairs in the public services department. Local option sales tax is dedicated towards capital projects, 70% streets and infrastructure and 30% community improvements. So it would just be a matter of, probably having to delay some of those out and push some of them back into later years on lost. So that's the one that we're tracking the most closely. We are still getting some clarifications from the state on what is considered to be reimbursable expenses and what are not. But the guidance there still is that, at least under the Stafford Act at the federal level, to be reimbursed, it has to be something that you can show that you used directly to serve a COVID positive person. So, things like Zoom licenses, like we're using for this type of a meeting, would not be eligible for reimbursement. The other piece, though, is that I believe the governor did announce that they were going to dedicate up to $125 million of the money that was received through the CARES Act to potentially be used for filling some of those gaps at the local government level. She did invite the league representatives to help in shaping what that program would look like, but I haven't seen any updates come out on that since the initial announcement.
Again, just a reminder for those of you who are on the call, if you have any questions that you would like to submit and have our panel consider, just use the group chat. You can send a message to everyone or just to me, either way. We'd be happy to talk through those questions. Lon, let me stick with you just real quick for the next question. So Lynn County, they have a 3-phased approach to advising and guiding businesses on how to open. And last week, they upgraded it based on data and cases and some other factors from phase 1 to phase 2. From a city perspective, what does that mean as far as consideration of reopening of public buildings, returning folks to work, just returning to providing services a little bit more to the way that they used to be? What has that phase change meant for the city?
For most of our facilities, as far as access to the public, it hasn't really made much of a change. Like for City Hall, our phase 1 and phase 2 are virtually identical, although we are more open to having people come in by appointment. Before, it was a last ditch or a last resort. Now we're more open to having people come in by appointment, assuming that they're observing the rules that we have set for the building. So it has allowed us to do things, though, on the outside. Like this week, we opened up the splash pads as of Monday. So I think that's been well received by the public. And then obviously, the governor has restricted some standards for other businesses as well. One of the other moves that we've made is, as of Monday, we have now resumed doing building inspections for residential construction. We have a process set up for doing that. I mean, there's some questions that we ask, and we don't want the area to be crawling with contractors and subcontractors while we're there. So it's the prime and our building inspector to make sure that we're still maintaining adequate safety. But we started to resume some of those outward facing services. We have not started back up with our rental housing inspections yet. That'll be probably one of the last services that we really reactivate.
I want to go back and talk about unemployment. Senator Mathis, I think you maybe mentioned that it was something that you really didn't have a chance to dive into in a big way. Our organization, we track these numbers regularly. It seems as though, for the time being, that we've reached a peak and are slowly moving in a positive direction. Though we know there's time will tell if we continue on that track. But early on, there was discussion about the concern of just the overall stability or funding of the unemployment trust fund. I believe there were some CARES Act dollars or some federal dollars that were allocated to shore up that fund so that wouldn't eventually become financial harm to the businesses, to all of us who pay into that. Where does that whole topic stand? Are we generally feeling okay about how those dollars really backfilled the utilization and the drawdown of that fund, or are we still not out of the storm?
No, I think that's a really good point, Nick. Actually, in our appropriations bill, there was a line that really pointed to that, and it says money received from the U.S. Department of Treasury under the Social Security Act will be appropriated to Iowa Workforce Development to administer unemployment compensation. So Beth Townsend, as you know, is the director of workforce development. So her staff worked like crazy to get unemployment claims answered and money, out to people who really needed it most. There were some hangups, of course, but, this was unprecedented. They had never done something like this. It was just a deluge of people, putting in applications. I have not heard from a constituent in probably a week and a half about any kind of problems. We were able to solve almost every unemployment issue that came our way with members of their office who were very helpful, and with our government liaison if we couldn't get something happening. What we had a lot of questions around were the stimulus checks. So how they were coming to people's, through people's mail, what they look like. Some people threw it away, because it came in the form of a card, and so that was very difficult. But what we did do, I want to just kind of veer to taxes a little bit about, the tax bill that came up. There were a couple of things that I was really uncomfortable with in the tax bill, but there were several things that were really good for our communities. And I voted yes on the tax bill this year because they had a paycheck protection program coupling. So it creates the income tax exemption for any loans as part of that PPP. So there was that. And then the Iowa Small Business Relief Program, which many people in our Marion and Cedar Rapids communities in Lynn County received those grants. We helped a couple of, downtown businesses in Marion with that. That will also be tax exempt for any of those loans. The Iowa Small Business Relief Grant Program that I just said, and then the Iowa Income Exclusion. This was not included in House File 2641, but because it's Department of Revenue policy, it's just going to be, there's no difference, effectively no difference between the House and the Senate bills with that. And so that goes on. And so does the income tax exclusion for the CARES Act emergency student grant money. That will not be taxed as well. So there are 4 areas: your student grant money that you may have received for your expenses, because the CARES Act flowed money to private, colleges and regional institutions to be able to defer or pay back some tuition or room and board, or give money for expenses. And that will not be, you won't have to claim that. Stimulus payments, grant relief, and PPP. So I thought we can't get any more. It's like a micro. It's almost like a micro bill where we look out, and almost everybody in all of our downtowns who received loans or grants would be affected by this tax bill. So I voted yes, because of all the stimulus that's out there, of all the loans that's out there. But there were some provisions in that tax bill I was not with, but I held my nose on those, and I went ahead and I did what I thought was right for the people in our community.
I'm going to add to that. I also voted for this and held my nose because of the good things that were in here. But on top of that, there's also something in there for the food banks for tax exemption, which also helps. So that was another good part of that bill to add to what Liz said.
That's great. I'm going to ask one more question, and then Shannon and Janelle, I'm going to come your way real quick. But one of the bills that, from an economic development standpoint, and for the developers who are on this call, I was surprised to see was kind of the surprise rebirth of $100 million towards another round of the Iowa Reinvestment District program. That was a program that the city of Marion put in an application for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. We're not awarded, but we really felt like it was a good program. For those of you that aren't aware, essentially what it does is it allows communities to identify district for a series of significant reinvestments and allows you to, it's kind of like a sales tax TIF. It allows a certain percentage of new sales tax generated by new development within this defined district to be rebated back to a community or project to help fund the project. And it was surprising that I think it's a good thing. I believe it's good policy, a good driver for redevelopment, but it kind of came out of nowhere and was passed. So any backstory on where that little piece of legislation came from?
Yeah, so I think some people brought it up, just, you know, like you have, that it works, right? It works in communities where you can do it, and it creates enthusiasm around development. So what we passed was reauthorizing a time frame on that Reinvestment Act. So it's for projects that applied from July 1st of 2020 to July 1st of 2025 to approve additional districts. So I don't know if you might want to maybe reapply. The division also revises the parameters of the size and the makeup of eligible districts to allow for projects that include area in more than one city. So they used, for example, the Des Moines legislators who were there used, for example, a project that they're doing, I think it's near Merle Hay Mall or something, and it straddles 2 different counties and 2 different municipalities, and they wanted to work on this project, so they were convincing enough to do it. So that first round in 2014 was created with about 100 million in it, and I know that Grinnell was successful, and Muscatine, and some of their hotel renovations and things like that. But this is going to reauthorize a new time frame.
How about,
that's what I got.
Yeah. How about for those communities that already figured out how to?
There was a lot of conversation behind the scenes about this, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Pick a new plan, Nick, and come up with a new.
There you go. Well, I have no doubt that our city manager is scratching his head right now, trying to figure out how we could leverage that program. So, thank you. Let's move back to the local level here, to our K-12 system. I think one of the things that everyone is anxious to hear more about is all of the work that everyone is tirelessly working to put together in a return to learn strategy. And I think it's, you know, very well known that everybody's putting together a multiple scenario approach to that. Perhaps we just simply ask, you know, where do we stand with that, and what are the biggest challenges that you're seeking to navigate, just besides simply the unknown of what this pandemic is going to do? So maybe this time I'll start with Superintendent Bisgard on updating us on those plans.
Thanks, Nick. I'm glad you let me go first, because I can steal all the ideas and leave Janelle scrambling then. So true teamwork. But as you mentioned, the state has directed us to put together a return to learn plan for school for next school year. And in that plan, and I'll cover kind of the high level pieces of this and leave the more specific pieces to Janelle. We have worked very closely, the 2 districts, along with Cedar Rapids and College Community as well, as we all try to figure this out. As you mentioned, there's a lot of challenges to this as well. And I think the biggest challenge for us is, as you said, the unknown, but just all the different hypotheticals and scenarios that could be 6 months from now or 2 months from now. What does that look like? And just trying to prepare for all of those different options. We had to do that in spring break quickly, so we have a little more time this time to plan, which is a wonderful thing, but also creates more challenges trying to figure out what that future is going to look like as well. But essentially, the plans we are getting prepared to submit to the state revolve around 3 areas. What's our school going to look like if we are back in session, so on site again? What does it look like if we are in online learning again, like we finished the school year with across the state this year? One difference next year would be it would have to be a required element. It cannot be optional for families. So that's a little bit different twist than it was this spring. And then the third plan that we are all looking into and working on, and is probably the most challenging one, is the hybrid model. So it wouldn't necessarily be all the kids back in school or all the kids online, but it could be a combination of those two, and all those different potential scenarios of how that would look. So each district is essentially putting together teams to dive into those and figure out what does that look like for all those scenarios? How do we do that? And essentially, we would all, our goal, our full intent is we want to be back in school. That's the premise we're working on. We want to be back in school for our kids. We want to be back in school for our families, our businesses. We know we're a key piece of the community that way. That's certainly where we're targeting. So a lot of our efforts are going into those plans. But we also know that may not be feasible. So if it's not feasible, what do the other options look like? The last thing I'll kind of leave with before I take everything, so I don't want to leave Janelle hanging, but is there's still some unknown for us around the lines of, will we be making that decision at the local district level, or will that be a governor legislative decision that's made as well later on this summer? So we're not sure on that front either, and that may evolve as the year goes on too. So the unknowns, Nick, as you said, are the challenge we're probably facing.
Shannon, is that a question that throughout your colleagues across the state are all asking that question? And is there different people providing guidance, or is it just simply one of those things that, we didn't think about that yet, or we don't know who would make that call?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a topic of conversation across the state for school superintendents. I'm not sure anybody's gotten different information on it yet. I'm not sure anybody's received any information on that yet. So we're just kind of in that waiting period to see what will that decision be. So yeah, that is probably the biggest question. Are we putting these plans together for help us make a decision what we do, or are we putting these plans together to be prepared for whatever the decision may be given for us? So that's the unknown. We're still trying to, we may not have answers on that for a little while, and that's frustrating because we know families want to know as soon as possible what the school will look like, and we would like that as well.
Yeah. Janelle, anything to add to that topic?
Well, as Shannon said, we've really collaborated on this. So I think the message you'll hear in our districts is very similar, although we recognize there's some uniquenesses across districts as well. I think key themes will be that the plan will be a fluid plan, that we're going to need to be responsive as the situation with COVID evolves in the upcoming years. So you asked about guidance, and are we receiving that with regard to, who will make the decision? I think the reality is right now there are so many guiding documents. One of the challenges is truly trying to figure out where to navigate, ensuring that we're safe, but recognizing that some of the guidance right now, for example, in Lynn County, is group sizes of 50 or less. Logistically, within our school buildings, that becomes a challenge. And so we're really focused on health and safety wise, how do we navigate hallway transitions, music, art, PE classes that may be a little bit larger, serving lunch, recess. How do you support kindergarten kids and preschool kids and what social distancing looks like? Because the reality is they're social beings. And I'm watching as our counties start to return just to the world of work. Adults aren't always really good at practicing social distancing because we're creatures of habit. And so those types of logistics are a challenge because as school leaders, certainly health and safety is always at the forefront. And I think I can speak for Shannon and I both that we take that very seriously. The health and safety of our staff and of our students is critical. But we also recognize that for our community to return economically to where we want to be, it hinges on kids being back in school. And so we're really caught in how do we best balance that in the current situation. So lots of scenario planning and just recognizing that we will have to be very responsive and fluid in implementation. The other thing I will just add is many are aware we submitted Return to Learn plan on July 1st to the Department of Education. And I think there's a little uncertainty around what does that mean. The actual template for what we will submit to the Department of Education is really a list of check boxes or assurances that we as districts say, yes, we've considered those things. So as far as community members being able to log into the Department of Education and view our plan, it won't be tangible in that same way, because it's so much of us as district leadership teams talking through the scenarios and being thoughtful in that planning. It's ensuring that we're considering those health and safety logistics while also really focusing on how are we going to close the educational gap in the upcoming year that will exist for some of our students. So that's really our focus. How do we get to the educational part? Get the other things in place so we can focus on what we do best, which is teach kids.
Yep, so many factors. You guys are doing a great job. I know it's been a long few months, but thanks to each of you for your leadership of our school districts. We greatly appreciate it, coming from the spouse of an educator. One more question related to school. Let's talk about construction projects, because there's also some things that need to happen for school to start on the construction front. So Janelle, do you guys have any big construction projects that are underway that are in hurry up mode, or what's your slate of projects looking like this summer?
We have very minimal things, nothing that would impact the start. So we'll leave that to Superintendent Biscard to respond to.
Well, it's important for me to know, because I usually get summoned the week before school to help set up the classroom, right? So what's it look like from your perspective, Shannon? I know Boulder Peak and Hazel Point are probably the two big projects that are very visible and everybody's watching.
You are correct. In addition to Boulder Peak and Hazel Point, our two new intermediate schools, we also have three of our older elementaries getting pretty substantial work being done this summer as well, at Indian Creek, Wilkins, and Bowman Woods. We were actually kind of fortunate because of the timing of everything. We were able to get a jump start on those projects this summer before school would have typically been out. So that has helped us a lot. So we feel very good that those projects will be done on time, ready to go as well. But all three of those buildings are look a little rough right now on the inside and the out, but that's a step backward before we go forward. And then the two new schools, as you mentioned, Boulder Peak and Hazel Point, considering everything, we knew we had a tight time frame. Weather has been challenging for the last year and a half since we started this project, and then COVID showing up in March. Considering all of that, I feel really good about where both buildings are at. We had real worries that the COVID impact would impact our building openings when it first happened, either due to workforce issues or supply chain issues, and both sites have had challenges with that. They've overcome that very nicely. I fully anticipate both schools will be ready to open in August. They both may not be completely finished. So when you mentioned the week before school notice, Nick, to come in and help, it might be more of the hours before school opens this year to come in and help get ready. And it might be messy in certain parts of the buildings, but we've really been working closely with the city of Marion to make sure if we only can get temporary occupancy, what does that look like, or partial occupancy. So we feel good about where things are at. And I am definitely going to knock on wood, because that could change anytime as things keep happening. But both contractors done a great job. I feel like we're in a really good spot there. So yep, looking forward to kicking those schools off this year. We just hope we can get kids in them now.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you, Shannon.
Yep. Can I give one last comment, Nick, as well? Yeah. I want to recognize both of our legislators today too, that them keeping the SSA promise that was made before COVID hit and honoring that afterwards. We can't emphasize enough how important that was. Our budgets were already certified, our staffings were already set. It would have put all schools in a really tough spot going forward. So we want to make sure to recognize that work that was done, and that was probably not an easy conversation potentially, I don't know. We know more tough conversations are probably looming in the future, but that was critical for both Limar and Marion and all of our schools in the area. So thank you.
That's great. We've got about 10 minutes left. Again, if anybody has a question you'd like us to consider, I think the ones that have been submitted, we've been able to cover. Doug, hold out. I'm going to get to you here in the end. Let's go back and talk. I know, again, a lot of the perhaps policy that would be on some of the advocacy agendas for organizations like ours they just didn't happen because there just wasn't the time to really get into that. So, some of the things that we had hoped to see some movement on were, the workforce housing tax credit program, huge backlog. To me, it didn't sound like that backlog was addressed. We had hoped maybe it could have been. And then the other topic was childcare. And while there, I think, are some provisions, perhaps within Future Ready Iowa, to help with some challenge grants per se, some different funding mechanisms. There was a lot of good legislation, or at least ideas, that were out there early in the session that my assumption is there just wasn't time to get to some of these big policy topics. Fair on both subjects there.
Yes, and I will tell you that, the portion of the increase going to the Child Care Challenge Fund ended up being $2 million. So she did put some money in there.
Okay. So that $2 million that you're referencing, Molly, again, it's essentially a pot of money that child care centers can leverage.
Yes.
Or
businesses that might work together to build some kind of a child care facility, or to renovate one that's already a building that's already there to make it a child care center.
Gotcha. Cool. So again, that was under Future Ready Iowa. So no doubt that childcare topic is not going to go away, and I'm sure we'll hopefully continue to pick up on some of that policy discussion next session.
They had 3 other things too that are going to help around childcare. And Traci Ehlert, I have to say, Representative Ehlert, who lives in Southwest Cedar Rapids, is just a tremendous advocate of this, and she just kept the conversation going and moving. So we want to give her credit for some of this. So one was increasing the number of families that qualify for early childhood development. So that would be ECD, and then also dependent care, CDC tax credits. So it doubled that amount. They expanded eligibility for child care assistance with a tiered copay system. And then they also changed the definition for infant and toddler, which would include children aged 2 weeks to 3 years and for preschool to include children 3 years to school age. And that's a really good change, I think, right there. It gives us some options to work with. I was on the subcommittee for Future Ready Iowa. There were 5 of us because the bill was so big, and that challenge fund is a big deal. It's a big deal for not only young parents, but it really, really helps them pursue their careers, and it helps them pursue their education in terms of knowing that money is available for reconstruction, remodeling, and something closer to their home or something affiliated with their school. So it's really good in attracting young parents to those areas.
Okay.
It's an area that obviously is very important for all the environments in our communities. We have to have childcare. To Traci Ehlert's credit, that is her background, and she is not going to let it go. And I know you would like to see that cliff removed as well, and we are going to work on it. That's just going to be next year now.
As we wrap up here this morning, I just open it up for any of you that have any final remarks or comments or topics on policy that we did not talk about. Again, I know that in a lot of ways we're still digesting kind of that what just happened type of thing, as I know everybody catches up on their sleep as well. So any final remarks?
I do want to say that I put 2 amendments on the tax bill. One was to aid the city of Cedar Rapids to try to recoup some sales tax money to continue the flood wall, and that would go to the Flood Mitigation Board. And so it was requesting a review of this sales tax collection, and maybe moving the dates around, moving the percentages around, and that would go for all flood mitigation projects. But it stalled out because we did not know if the amendment would be voted down, how that might affect a Moody's rating. So Moody's will look at things, and if you go in for it and you don't, if the legislature votes it down, sometimes that affects it. If it votes up, that affects it as well. So that was one thing. So I put it in and then I pulled it because I didn't want any cities to be negatively affected by that. But I did also put an amendment in about Prospect Meadows. You know, they have a sales tax rebate up to 5 million or 10 years. So I added 11 years because I know that Prospect Meadows, you know, had stacked a lot of teams to play out at the ballpark in March, April, and May, and they weren't able to get them there. So that was a significant dent on their sales tax rebate. That failed to get the votes. We had, you know, party line vote on that, including the senator where the Prospect Meadows complex is located. So I was disappointed in that. But other than that, you know, we're going to go back at it next year and we'll reevaluate some things. The real, the real transition, I'm sorry, will come really, I think, for, especially coupled with unemployment, will be 6 months from now and 7 months from now. So that will be something that we'll really have to take into account when we plan our next budget. If we can't get our economy going again the way that it was, we're going to see some more people on Medicaid, more people using FIP and food, food assistance. And so, you know, we just have to keep our eyes open about that. Sorry, Molly, go ahead.
That's all right. I was just going to quickly say, you know, the last couple of weeks were kind of gloom and doom because it was shoving these things, you know, out quickly and not necessarily things that we thought we were going to go back and do to help our communities. There were a lot of good things that happened this year. And I was just going to point out, you know, just a few of them just to remind you that some good things did happen. It wasn't just the racial injustice with the Better Union bill that we passed, but also, you know, we've raised the minimum age for tobacco, so hopefully we can get that out of our schools. We've, you know, expanded access to healthcare providers and services throughout the state. We've helped with rural schools covering bus costs and improving classrooms for students for behavior. Wasn't my favorite bill, and I'm going to fix it when I go back next year, but at least it's a start. And then, you know, we've expanded special education opportunities, and we worked on expanding the reading help for dyslexic students. There were lots of things that happened. We're expanding broadband across the state of Iowa. So there are a lot of good things that did happen, and I just have to take those away after this last week and kind of digest the fact that we did some good things.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks again to both of you for your leadership at the State House. Thanks for always being accessible to us when we have things that we need advocated for. So we really appreciate your work. Hey, one final shout out. I got a little message from my friend Doug Newman at the Economic Alliance. So Medco is proud to be a partner in any way that we can for the new Rally Cap initiative. It's really an initiative designed to, there you go, Doug. You finally show your face with the Rally Cap. Attaboy. How are we supposed to wear those? I don't know.
I was going to wear mine to the
couple
meeting,
bald guys putting a hat on here. Anyway, you can get to it. We've got a big banner on our homepage to get to the Economic Alliance site. You can go to the direct to the Economic Alliance site. Check out the participating businesses. Support them. We really need to support our locally owned businesses, and there's just kind of a great fun way that you can get involved and eventually get some of this swag that Doug and I are wearing here today. So check
mine's
out
in the other room.
Okay. All right. That's good. That's good. So, well, thanks everybody again for participating. We really appreciate it. I would encourage all of you on the call, if you have any follow-up questions, all these people love to be contacted directly. Please do that. And until next time, we'll talk to y'all later. Thank you.
Thank you.